Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE, GMAT, and graduate school admission. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE. A full textbook, videos on key topics, tons of questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, a built-in study planner and essay grader, and full-length practice exams. You can try it out for free by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. So today we've got Brian Prestia back on the show with us. Brian, I'd love if you could introduce yourself and your company.
Yeah, I'm Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. We do GRE, GMAT, SAT, and ACT tutoring. It's all online, and our focus is on the reasoning and critical thinking aspects of the tests.
Yeah, fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about time management for the GRE and GMAT, throwing a little twist in there, right? And, part of it is just like different tips for both. But then also I think this will kind of illuminate how the tests are different in kind of how they're executed by the student, right?
Yeah. So, I think there's a lot to say here. There's a lot we can pack into this. I don't know if you want me to kind of lead by giving you maybe two high-level thoughts, and then we could dive into the details.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's start there.
Okay, so I think you can think about time management in two ways. One is what I would call like global time management strategies. So kind of how you manage your way through each section of the test, the decisions you make about, okay, should I let go of this question? Should I move quickly here, try to get to the end and maybe go back to questions? So that's what I would call global time management strategies. And then there are ways to be fast or not fast on individual questions, right? So there's like a separate thing of, a question is right now taking me 3 minutes. Is there a way that I can do that same question in 2 minutes or a minute and a half or something like that? So those are kind of the two ways that we tend to teach it. And then, there's a lot of detail within both of those. And then, some similarities and some differences on both GRE and GMAT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that just in general, like these tests are pretty similar. It's just that I think the GMAT has a little bit more restrictions on some of the tactics that are really good for the GRE, right? Specifically like the skipping question.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I can talk a little bit about like the global time management stuff and how it's similar and yet different also on both tests. So I mean, basically, I think there's bad, and then there's better, and then there's best in terms of how you get through a section. And this would apply to both GRE and GMAT. So this is similar across both of these. I mean, what happens to a lot of people when they first start taking practice tests is that, and this would be the bad, is that they don't even finish the section, right? They like get towards the end of the section and there are, questions left, and, they either don't even answer those questions or they quickly, make guesses at the end. Actually, that's one difference right there. On the GRE, there's no penalty for not answering anything, although it's foolish to not just put answers in. Whereas on the GMAT, if you don't answer questions at the end, there's a severe penalty for not answering them. You'd be better off just guessing and putting in
You're
answers. Right. So that's one small difference. But anyway, that's like the bad, right? And then the better is, actually finishing. Let's say with 5 seconds left, you get your last answer in and, you were rushing maybe a little bit, but you more or less had time to finish. That's better, obviously much, much better. And then I would argue the best scenario is to finish early, because now the GMAT offers the ability to go back and edit questions. And that's pretty, the GRE basically has always had that ability since it's been computer adaptive. And so I would argue that's the best scenario, is that you finish early, and then circle back to questions that you either guessed on or, just completely dumped.
Right.
That's easier. The thing that, from experience, I can say that's easier said than done.
Right. Well, I think the other thing too is that, the GRE, to me, at least my approach with it would be almost like a triage situation where, like, if I look at a question, if I can't answer it right away, I just skip it immediately. And then you kind of finish, and then you're like, okay, I skipped 7 questions. I have 17 minutes left. So now I'm going to try and go get as many of those as I can, right? And I think that that's really kind of, for me, like the cornerstone time management strategy for the GRE, right? Is to just approach it with this like triage approach. And then the GMAT, you just can't do that. Like you kind of have to approach the test linearly. You get three skips, right?
Yeah, well, not skips. So
Or
this
redos, three
Yeah,
redos.
three redos, but it's actually more than three redos. So I'd say for all intents and purposes, they really are the same in that way because you're only allowed to change the answers to three questions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you can go back to as many as you want. You can go back to eight questions if you want, but you can only change your answer to three of them. So yeah, you can't do what you could do on the GRE, which is just like flatly skip the question. Like, all right, I'm not even putting in an answer here. I'm just going to move on, and I'll move on from this one. I'll move on from that one. You could do that, like you said, on seven questions in a section. On the GMAT, you have to put in an answer before you can move on to the next question. So
Right.
it's really effectively you're going back and deciding whether you want to, spend more time on that question and change your answer. I can say that, yeah, again, if you were to like literally just bubble in an answer on 10 questions and not even look at them and then go back, obviously you're going to want to change the answer to more than three questions. But in practice, I've yet to see anyone want to, or, actually like run out of changes because, by the time you get to the end of the section and go back, even if you're going back to five questions, you're probably not changing the answer to more than three. So yeah, actually, you can do something pretty similar on the GMAT to what you're doing on the GRE. There is one caveat though about the scoring algorithm that I can throw in here if you want.
Yeah, let's do that. What's the caveat?
Caveat is, again, this is where we get into the weeds here. So the caveat is that the GMAT is question adaptive, right? So the reason you're only allowed
Right.
to change your answer to three questions is that the algorithm is judging you question by question as you go, right? So if
Right.
you were to go back and like just change everything, well then like the algorithm would be very confused by that and maybe would have given you a different set of questions, right? So for example, if you got, 10 questions wrong, well then it's going to be giving you fairly easy questions on the other, 10 or 11 questions depending on what section you're on, 13 questions. And so yeah, so that's why you're only allowed to change three because otherwise it just screws up the whole algorithm. So how this affects test takers is you you don't want to be quite as aggressive, I would say, about like just dumping questions and putting answers in. Not because you only have three questions you can edit, but because like if you're dumping the three of the first five questions, well then, and let's just say you get them wrong, or you just like put in an answer and get them wrong. Well,
Right.
now you're going to be seeing easier questions possibly for a while. And so even if you go back and
Well,
fit,
and it's also like you put yourself on a track, right? Like I don't know this for a fact. This is me speculating, but the way that I understand machine learning is basically, the machine takes a step and then reevaluates and then takes a step and then reevaluates, takes a step. So if your first five data points are a bunch of wrong answers, it's going to go, wow, this guy's really like needs to be in the low scoring, easy question part of the database. And then even if you start nailing those questions, it's just going to think that it was correct in assuming that you be in that area, not necessarily get you back up as quickly as you ought to be into the middle score section of the range, right? Versus if you answer questions well at the beginning,
right.
it kind of establishes this baseline where it's like, okay, this guy's at least answering like 600 level questions correctly, so we should kind of start there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, and so that's why, like you said, it doesn't adapt quite as quickly as you might think. As you said, if you're getting some questions wrong and it's giving you easier questions and you're getting them right, well, yeah, you're just kind of confirming that is maybe the level that you're at. Of course, eventually it starts giving you harder ones. It's also worth saying it doesn't move perfectly linearly. It jumps around a bit, and it's constantly evaluating, like you said, everything that happened previously. So when you go back, it's
Right.
almost like I'm gonna go way back with my movie reference here, but it's almost like Back to the Future, where like if you like go back to some point in the past and like change things, it sort of screws everything up. So yeah, you can't you don't want to be quite as cavalier about just like letting go of questions as you might be able to do on the GRE.
Well, I also think that like you've kind of identified what actually happened, right? Which my assumption, because there's no way to not do it, right? Like let's say you finish, get through all the GMAT questions in the section. You get to the end. You now have seen the 20 questions or whatever that they're going to show you, and they can't like change that question. So what when you go backwards to update your answer to a question, it's likely that that does not factor into the algorithm, right? So you're like that's my guess because like if you finished all the questions, then they've selected the difficulty for all the questions that you've seen already, right? And if you haven't finished all the questions, then I'm not sure. But if you have finished all the questions before you go back, you know that you improving your answers on the previous questions are not going to change that algorithm because it can't. There's nothing for it to change. It has no new questions to give you. So you're kind of like you've already made your bed at that point. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact nuances of the algorithm. I gotta believe that they wouldn't have this feature there if it was totally meaningless. You know what I mean? So
mm,
I have to believe that it has some effect on your score if you go back and change some wrong answers to right answers. But yeah, it can't have a huge effect because, as you said, if you're seeing easier questions, then that doesn't really the algorithm hasn't seen you prove that you can answer very hard questions. So I mean, it can't give you a much
yeah,
higher score, maybe a little bit of a higher score. So
yeah,
that's my guess. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, again, we're both guessing. So I don't mean to. I don't mean to imply to the listener that I know more than anybody else. But I'm just basing it off of what I know about how computer programs work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think just in general, like the going back on the GRE or excuse me on the GMAT is almost more something that you should look at as a thing that you should use sparingly if you have to, kind of thing. And you get like three redos, but like otherwise you need to kind of take the test linearly, like you always have. Versus the GRE is literally a test where you should skip every question that you don't immediately know how to solve and then go back and figure out the 10 that you didn't do, right? As opposed to like only having three redos.
So let me comment. So yes, 100% agree. And I think the problem is that what you're describing on the GRE is like the optimal way to do it. Yeah, I 100%
Mm-hmm.
agree with that. And I'd even have like a nice little, analogy here. It's kind of like if, someone put, 50 basketballs on a court. Some were like pretty
Mm-hmm.
close to the rim, some were at half court, some were right, and said, I'll give you, $10 for everyone you can make in a minute or 2 minutes. Like obviously you'd be smart to start at the ones right underneath the basket and work your way to half court. Like you wouldn't start with a half court shot, right? That would be pretty
Mm-hmm.
foolish. And so, yeah, that's exactly well, maybe not exactly, but that's how it is on the GRE, where you've got some questions that are easy, some that are very hard. And yeah, it makes sense to obviously skip the ones that when you look at, you're like, oh man, this looks pretty hard, or I don't really know how to do it. The truth is though, Tyler, is that even on the GRE, people don't do that. Even when like we're coaching people to do that, they just don't. It's very hard to get people out of the like linear test mentality of like, well, like I'll just do the questions in order. So the idea that you're going to like get to the end with 5 or 10 minutes to spare, it's actually pretty hard to get people to do that, but
Mm-hmm.
that is the optimal way to do it because, why would you spend 3 minutes or 4 minutes on something when the very next question might be very easy? So,
And it's also, yeah, I mean, I think that it's just in general the sort of the difference in the philosophy of people that make tests too, right? Like I think the GMAT really doesn't want you to go back. I think they kind of added that feature begrudgingly,
totally. Yep.
right?
100%. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the GRE and the GMAT are like in competition with each other. So they're always trying to one up each other. I don't think I said this on a previous podcast with you, but maybe this will be a repeat. But the joke I'm going to use another old movie reference here, but they keep trying to sort of outplay the other, right? So when one test is like, oh, we're gonna make our test shorter. Well, then like a week later, the other test is like, oh, well, you know what, we're gonna go even shorter than you. And it's like I don't know if you remember the scene, but there's a scene in There's Something About Mary with Ben Stiller when he picks up this like hitchhiker, and the guy's like, I got this great idea, for like a video I'm gonna do. It's like, 7-minute abs. So he's like, they have 8-minute abs already, and I have this brilliant idea. It's 7-minute abs, and then Ben Stiller's like, well, what if then someone comes out with 6-minute abs? And he's like, he just starts like tweaking and like he doesn't know what to do with himself. So that's kind of like what the GMAT and the GRE do. They're always trying to outplay each other. And so yeah, I totally agree. That was definitely a like, oh well, we're user friendly also.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But all very interesting though. I mean, I think yeah, so timing is just like such a huge part of both of these tests. Other than the skipping questions, which I think we've talked that one through pretty well at this point. Like what are some other time management strategies maybe like that apply to both, or we can like go test by test?
Yeah. Well, so then I guess I would maybe kind of pivot the discussion into but this could be a long discussion, pivot the discussion into more of the like question specific time
Mm.
management skills, right? Where it's maybe not just kind of how you're managing the section, but how you think about approaching individual questions and how you can be more effective on those questions. Again, that's a whole thing that like we spend a lot of time helping people with because people tend to be surprisingly bad. They've got one gear. It's I'm just all in and I'm just going to do this question, in one particular way and however long it takes me and that's it. When, they don't realize there's, really a variety of options for what you could do on most questions. So anyway, we could go in that direction if you want.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I wonder if that's going to be more test specific, but I think we can probably just go for it, not worry about that too much.
Yeah. No,
Um, so yeah.
I think both, so the GRE and the GMAT have some different question types. Well, actually, you know what? Maybe let me mention this up front about the differences, actually, because this a little bit still overlaps with the kind of global time management strategy stuff. So one thing that I would tell GRE test takers on the quant section, and then I think on the GMAT quant you can't do this, but on the data insights section you can do this. So basically, some questions are just easier to be fast on, and other questions are harder
Mm.
to be fast on, right? So for quantitative comparisons, they're just much easier to be very fast on. So it always like frustrates me when I'm tutoring someone and I see that they've spent a lot of time on the QCs, and then and those questions come first in each section usually. So they'll have spent a lot of time on those, and then like run out of time on the problem solving questions that follow. So with the QCs, I mean, this is a little silly, but first of all, there's only 4 answer choices, right? Not 5.
Right,
So already, already, if you're just making a blind guess, you're statistically more likely to get the question right, right? So that's one thing.
right.
And then second thing is, you have the not enough information option, right? Like choice D. So that like in a lot of cases, it's obvious that the question can be answered. You know what I mean? Like there's no way it's a case of like there isn't enough information to answer this. It's obvious that the number of ways of choosing 3 employees from a company of 10 employees. Like there obviously is a number. There is a known value for that. So like D is off the table. So now you're down to A, B, or C, right? And
Hmm.
and then often you can narrow it down further in very, very little time, right? You can just like on some questions, you can just number pick and you're like, okay, in this case,
Hmm.
I just spent 10 seconds number picking. In this case, quantity A is bigger, right? Well, now you know it's either A or D. I mean, it's a 50-50 shot and you've only spent, 15 seconds on the question. So it's just virtually impossible to do that on the regular, what I call problem solving questions, the regular multiple
Hmm.
choice ones. So anyway, QCs are, in my opinion, the place to, if you're really struggling with time, it's possible to be much faster there. And then,
One QCs also, like you said, are because of the format of the question, they're particularly suited for this approach.
mhm,
And that's the thing with the GRE is, you're trying to bank time for the end because you can always, if you're like 50-50 on something, you can always go back.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are cases where this is gonna seem outrageous to you, but you might like this, and the listeners might like this too. So the example I just gave of like, how many ways can you choose, three employees from like a group of 10 or whatever, right? So usually that'll be like one quantity. That'll be like quantity A, right? And quantity B will be like, you know, 70 or something like that, some number, right? So either quantity A is either equal to 70 or it's bigger than 70 or less than 70. So I mean, again, you have a 1 in 3 shot at that point. Often often what happens is it's often equal to that quantity, right? Like for whatever reason, when they set it up like that, where you're kind of calculating one quantity and the other quantity is just a number that they give you, it's often C. It's often that they're equal. So if you're really someone who struggles with timing, right? Like you could just pick C and flag the question and come back. And I'd say, well, you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting it for sure, but it's probably more likely than that. I'd say it's much more likely that it's C in a case like that than A or B. So, maybe you have a 50% chance of getting it right, and you haven't really done anything, right? And again, you can
Right.
still come.
And that took you 5 seconds.
Yeah,
Right.
totally. Yeah. So if you want, I can also pivot this to data sufficiency if you want me to quickly tie that in.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. That's a good one.
Okay. So unfortunately, with the GMAT now, the quant section no longer has data sufficiency. So if you're trying to make up time on the quant section, you're really only dealing with problem solving questions. And for that, you don't have QCs, you don't have data sufficiency to kind of leverage there. But on the data insight section, a lot of people struggle with time. It's a lot of information, it's a lot of charts, a lot of like reading passages even, and so people really struggle with time there. So data sufficiency is very similar to quantitative comparisons in a lot of ways, and it's similar in that it affords an opportunity to be fast in very similar ways. So you can often look at the question and it's obvious that the statements alone are not sufficient, right? Like clearly
Yeah.
statement 1 is not sufficient, statement 2 is not sufficient. So then it's just either together they're sufficient or even together they're still not sufficient. And that would be like C or E, right? So again, that could be a hard call, right? It could take many minutes to try to figure out whether it's C or E, but you're at a 50-50 shot in 30 seconds. Why not just, if you think that you're going to run out of time, why not just take that shot, move on, and then you can come back to it and work it out later.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you might be using one of your 3 retakes to do it, but I think that, that's probably a decent place to use it, right? Rather than using your retake on a problem that you spent 4 minutes on and still got to a 50-50 on.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And frankly, if you're good at data sufficiency, you can often have a hunch where it's like definitely a 50-50. It's either this answer or that answer. But of those two answers, one of them is kind of clearly more of like the sucker answer, and the other answer is more likely to be the right answer. And so what looks like a 50-50 is probably more like an 80-20, right? So if you think about it, I mean, if I have an 80% chance of getting the question right and I've spent 30 seconds, like why not just take it? Am I going to spend another 3 minutes to clear out that extra 20% where I get to a place of certainty? I mean, yeah, if I had a million, if I had all the time in the world to spend on it, then maybe. But it's a game of like playing percentages and trying to allocate time most effectively.
Yep. Yeah, and it's about thinking of these tests as like a game or a challenge rather than, for lack of a better word, a test, right? I think that a lot of people just kind of approach these tests the same way they approach tests in school, where it's like, you start on question 1 and you finish on the last question, and it tests you on all the things that you learned, and if you learned them, then you will get a good score, right? Like that's not how these tests are built, and that's not how you should approach.
No. Yeah, not at all. I mean, and you could be like, there are people who bemoan this and will say, well, like that kind of, game theory stuff, it's so silly that that's part of these tests. But I mean, I would argue that you are, it's another way of like assessing someone's, reasoning, their like executive function, right? Like that's important in graduate school. Like you're often given way more to do than you can possibly do in a week, and knowing
Mhm.
how to allocate your time smartly and how to be efficient with your time and what to kind of get rid of and what to focus on, what to prioritize, like that's all important in graduate school.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's also important for getting a good score.
Yeah, totally. Unfortunately, most people don't understand how important it is, but yeah, I mean, like I said to you before, Tyler, like people don't, sounds like you came easy to you to like let go of questions and get to the end of the section and go back, but I think it's actually quite rare. In my experience, like most people just aren't doing that. Even when you're telling them to do it, they're not doing it.
Right. Well, yeah, so we talked about guessing strategies on each test. We talked about just like general time management, prioritization, a couple different question types. Are there any other things you want to wrap up with here?
Well, I don't know if we want to save it for another, future podcast, but I think there's a lot to say about how to be faster. It was like at the top, I mentioned there's kind of global time management and then, question specific stuff. So I think there's a lot more we
Mhm.
could say about the problem solving questions that make up most of the quant section on the GRE and all of the quant section on the GMAT, and like maybe specific things that you could do to be faster there. I don't know if we want to save
Mhm.
that for a future podcast.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that's the whole episode right there. Well, then that sounds good. We can wrap this one up then. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Brian Prestia from Reason Test Prep. And Achievable has a great online GRE course. You can try it for free by going to achievable.me. And be sure to use the code podcast to get 10% off.